Welcome everybody else. Welcome back to session number 2 of Ruth. When we finally dig into it, you got all the preliminary background stuff last week. So when you read it, you said, I know all this. We got all that? No. Well, let's start with a prayer, but we'll do some of what you've been studying just to call to mind the presence of the Lord in Ruth. And it happened in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a man went from Bethlehem to sojourn in the plains of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites from Bethlehem of Judah. And they came to the plains of Moab, and they were there, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. And she, together with her 2 sons, was left. And they took for themselves Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there some 10 years. And the 2 of them, Mahlon and Chilion, died as well. And the woman was left of her 2 children and her husband. And she rose, and she and her daughters-in-law, and turned back from the plains of Moab, for they had heard in the plains of Moab that the Lord had singled out his people to give them bread. And she went out from the place where she had been with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to go back to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord do kindness with you as you have done with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you find a settled place, each of you, in the house of her husband." She kissed them, and they raised their voice and wept. And they said to her, "But with you we will go back to your people." And Naomi said, "Go back, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb who could be husbands to you? Go back, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. And even had I thought, I have hope, this very night I shall have a husband and bear sons, would you wait for them until they grew up? For them, you would be deprived of husbands? No, my daughters, for it is far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has come out against me." They raised their voice and wept once more. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people. Go back after your sister-in-law." And Ruth said, "Do not entreat me to forsake you, to turn back from you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people is my people. Your God is my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. And so may the Lord do to me, or even more, for only death will part you and me." And Naomi saw that she was insisting on going with her, and she ceased speaking to her. Well, God of love, we notice the amazing commitment of Ruth tonight in the midst of great tragedy. And we ask you to inspire us by her story and her life and your Spirit, so that we too might cling to you and know that in your love we find life. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. That version I read in the prayer is probably a little bit different from what's in your Bibles. A couple years ago, a fellow completed his task, a Jewish guy, Robert Alter, and his attempt was to put the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, into English as close as possible to the Hebrew. So it may not always make sense grammatically. And one of his things as a translator is really against Christian scholars who are translating the Bible. He says they try to make it too easy for you. They assume you don't know anything or can't handle any kind of challenging sentence. So Christian translators smooth it out and make it easier to understand. So if you want to read the Hebrew Bible in as close as possible to the English, unless you're going to read it in Hebrew, he's got a 3-volume series out. But one thing you would notice that Ruth is in the volume on the writings. So I don't think it's in exact order of how the scrolls were kept. Because my understanding was that in the scrolls that Ruth followed Proverbs. And that Proverbs ends with the last chapter is about the good wife, the woman of great valor. And then it goes right into Ruth. But that's not, he has it following Song of Songs. And for those of you who are in Song of Songs, you think, oh, great, we just studied that. And then what follows is Lamentations, which Ruth is kind of a little bit of both. So maybe that's why the Jewish community puts it there, because we have a love story, like Song of Songs, and we have a woman who's lamenting, Naomi, and so it belongs with Lamentations. But anyway, it's there. In the Christian Bible, it's in with the history books between Judges and Samuel. All right, so at your tables, jump in, and we'll take the next 20, 30 minutes and have you be scholars at your tables with the questions from last week. So enjoy. Don't worry about it. A lot of times there's no right answer, so don't assume that, because sometimes people ask me, what is the answer? Well, whatever you put down.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to interrupt the great discussions that are going on at your table, because we'll try to cover some of those last ones and what we're getting in chapter 2. But I think it's always such a great thing to engage your own experiences and your own reading of the scriptures, and I always think you can do just as good as scholars most of the time. With a little bit of help from the footnotes, you're fine. Because you think, what are they saying? And then you look at the footnote and you think, oh, that's what they're saying. Most of the answers are there in the footnotes. Before we get into going line by line through these 2 chapters, there were 2 handouts as you came in, and I'd like to just talk, not go through the whole thing, but just to talk about those briefly, because I think they're kind of important concepts for what we're getting into. And next week we'll talk a little bit more about the whole notion of levirate marriage, which is what happens between Boaz and Ruth. So first of all, this one that's entitled Chesed. Chesed is the Hebrew word for love, but a unique kind of love. I suppose in Greek it might get translated agape. The other Hebrew word is hen, H-E-N. That normally gets translated into grace. So when we go into the English, it becomes grace. But chesed is what we're experiencing in this story of Ruth. Ruth has it, Boaz has it, and behind the scenes, God has it. So there's a couple notions of chesed. It's translated into English in probably about 40 or 50 different ways. It appears like over 200 times in the Old Testament. Hen appears only about 60 times. But chesed appears a lot of times, but it gets translated all kinds of different ways because of its context. So it's not romantic love, it's not infatuation, it's faithful, reliable love. It's one of the most fundamental characteristics of the Jewish notion of God because it's consistent with his covenantal nature. So one definition was Hesed is wrapping up in itself all the positive attributes of God: love, covenant faithfulness, mercy, grace, kindness, loyalty, acts of devotion. Loving kindness goes beyond all the requirements of duty. So the scholars would say Chesed has two essential qualities. First of all, it has to be a free act. The one performing the act may have a privately or publicly recognized responsibility in the matter because of the relationship in which he or she stands to the one in need, but there is no binding legal obligation. The act is one of gracious, loving kindness. And the other essential quality is, in English, mercy. The act involves an extraordinary amount of generosity or mercy, going well beyond the call of duty. So what we're going to see in Boaz and what we see in Ruth's commitment to Naomi is chesed. It's living out in a very concrete way what that kind of love looks like. Boaz's generosity to her initially when she's kind of hanging around and picking up the droppings in the field, and his inviting her into getting more, and then his willingness in the end to get married to her. And then Ruth's just total commitment to Naomi, which we'll get into here in a little bit. So concrete expressions of chesed. And then the goel. So we only get a little bit of the nature of the goel tonight at the end of chapter 2, but we'll get a lot more of it next week. But the whole notion of Jesus as Redeemer comes from this Old Testament notion of the goel, somebody who offers their money or time or energy in exchange to help somebody else. So a little quote from Leviticus to begin with, to give you some kind of feeling for the law. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then the next of kin shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him reckon the years since he sold it and pay back the overpayment to the man to whom he sold it, and he shall return his property. But if he has not sufficient means to get it back for himself, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of the Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. Basic to the laws of the land in the Old Testament is the conviction that God is the true owner of the land, and no land shall be sold in forever, because the land belongs to God. Everybody else is only on the land a short period of time. So the whole notion in Israel was that now there's debate among scholars whether the Jubilee year took place every 50 years. So the notion was you sold your land knowing you got it back in 50 years if you were at the beginning of the Jubilee. So you knew you were going to get the land back, whether that happened or not. But what did happen was that the family always had the right to the land. If that's your land, you could always buy it back. And the owner had to sell it to you because it belonged to the family. And we're going to get a little bit of this next week when we get Boaz getting Elimelech's land that somehow is still sitting there. What happened to it? It's not clear what happened to it as we get into that. When they go to Moab, did he sell the land to somebody when he left for Moab? Or did it just sit there waiting for him to get back and then he dies in Moab? So we don't know. Now there are other notions of the Goel, and we'll get into some of that next week more as well. So the Goel describes a close relative, a kinsman redeemer, who takes upon himself the duties on behalf of needy family members. So if somebody got murdered, or even killed accidentally, sometimes in the Old Testament, then the Goel would get revenge. So that was their responsibility to do that. There's also if you just happen to be, as I joked about last week, in jail or in slavery because you didn't pay your credit card bills, then the Goel had to redeem you and get you out of jail or out of. You hear that in Jesus stories, when Jesus is telling the story about the guy who wouldn't forgive the person their debt, and so he puts him in prison until he can pay his debt. And always we think, how is he going to pay his debt? He's in prison. There's no way he's going to pay his debt. That story doesn't make sense, Jesus. Well, it made sense because the Goel is supposed to step up. So he's in jail until the family redeemer steps up and says, oh, okay, I'll pay his MasterCard bill. And then he can get out of jail and go on. So we'll get into it more next week, but just a little introduction again to the Goel. So turn to the beginning of the book of Ruth, and we'll just kind of walk slowly through this. So it begins, as we talked about last week, once back in the time of Judges. Not a very pleasant time in Israel. The time between Joshua and Saul, about a 200-year period. There was a lot of violence during that period. We don't know exactly, because it doesn't tell us, when Ruth's story falls. But if you want to look on that list of judges that we do have, we don't have all the judges. They're not all in the book of Judges. There are a lot of judges that are not in the book because they were resolving disputes between people. Just the more famous ones end up in the book of Judges. But sometime, maybe between Ehud and Jephthah, is when Ruth's story falls. That's what the scholars say. But but we don't know. Part of the problem is in that genealogy thing that we got, and especially in Matthew's, Boaz is the son of Rahab. And Rahab was the prostitute who helped them get into the land. And so that would seem to move this up to an early time in Judges. But then Ruth is David's great-grandma. And so then it has to be a later time in Judges. So it's not clear when it is. So we don't know exactly. And the scholars would say, it's not important. So this whole introductory lines, because they're so brief, without any background, are really not important to the story. They're just kind of setting the stage. Okay, this was during the time of Judges. That's all you need to know. During the time of Judges, not a great time. And during that time of Judges, what happened? There was a famine in the land. And normally in the Old Testament, there would be some reason for a famine. The people were not worshiping God correctly. And so there's a famine. Doesn't say. And so then the scholars would say, well, probably because it wasn't because they weren't worshiping correctly. It just was a famine. Those things happen now and then. And where do they live? They live in Bethlehem of Judah. So those of you who've been to Bethlehem might know this experience. So Bethlehem's right south of Jerusalem. It sits right on the edge of the Judean wilderness. When we were talking earlier, Anne was remembering on our trip to Israel that as you went east from Jerusalem, you have all this lush palm trees and green. You go through a tunnel, and you get on the other side of the tunnel, and nothing grows there. It's just rock. And you think, what is this? How can I go through a tunnel and have that experience? Well, you go into the Judean wilderness, which is nothing grows there. It doesn't rain there. So Bethlehem and Jerusalem are just north and south of each other. They're sitting right on the edge of the Judean wilderness. It is very likely that droughts happen quite often in Bethlehem because of where it's situated. The rain falls to Bethlehem and then it doesn't fall. So it's just right there. But from Bethlehem's on a hill, you can see the Dead Sea on a clear day from Bethlehem. You can also see Moab from Bethlehem. So there's the Rift Valley to the east, which is where the Dead Sea is. In that Rift Valley, it runs from north of Israel all the way through Africa. That's a long Rift Valley, but you can see Moab over there. And so probably they could sit at their house and nothing was growing where they were, and they could see Moab and it was green over there, and they said, hey, why don't we go over there? Because they're getting rain over there, but we're not getting rain here. So let's just go to Moab. So he leaves home with his wife and his 2 sons, and they reside on the plateau of Moab. There are actually times in the history, as we talked about last week, that the relationships between Israel and Moab were not great because of the ancestors and that they were the weird relatives of Israel. And so there were times when the relationship with Moab was good. David goes and spends some time there as well. Israel itself spent time there before it went into the Holy Land. So it's not always bad to go to Moab. And so where some commentators would say that Elimelech made a mistake to go to Moab, and that's why he dies, and that's why his kids die. Other scholars would say there's absolutely no evidence of that. Again, because they would say it's not important to the story. Why they died, how they died, not important. What's important is Naomi's story and Ruth's story, not Elimelech's story, and not these two boys who have bad names. Did you note that in the footnotes? Mahlon and Chilion. A lot of different translations for those names. But mostly, one boy is named Sickly, and one boy is named Not Gonna Last. So who would name their kids that? Yeah. Okay, they come out and like, woof, that one's Sickly. So we're just gonna name him, that's Sicko right there. He's not gonna make it. And the other one's not gonna last, not gonna succeed. He's gonna die, I think. And then they do. So you think, okay, they name their kids these things, and then whoop. Elimelech's name, so El, whenever you see that in the Old Testament, that's God. So Eli is my God. Those of you who remember on Palm Sunday or Good Friday, Jesus on the cross says, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? So Eli is my God, and then this Elimelech is my God is king. So it's a nice name to have. And then Naomi, her name is lovely, or pretty, or pleasant. So she has that name, but then in a little while, when she comes back from Moab, she doesn't like her name anymore. I'm not lovely anymore. I'm bitter. So she wants her name changed. So anyway, they go off to Moab with these strange names. But also they were Ephrathites. So that is a clan there. And it's important because it's one of the first families in Bethlehem. And there's one other person who's in the history of Israel who's an Ephrathite, who's really important, and he is David. So David was an Ephrathite from that clan in Bethlehem. They go to Moab. And after some time, Elimelech dies. She's left with her two sons. And they marry these Moabite women. We don't get any of the details of their courtship or their marriage. Sad. All we get is, yep, they got married.
It's not important.
Not important, no. Not important to the story. The only thing that's important is they got married. These two girls got married to these sickly Jewish boys. They must have been really nice girls because they said, oh boy, these guys, they want us. You have to imagine that this tale is in the oral tradition, mostly. So it's being passed down over and over again in the oral tradition. So as the storyteller is telling it, when he gets to this next spot, he might have paused. Because he would say, when they had lived there about 10 years, 10 years after people get married, what would you expect is going to happen? They have babies. And their kids are, how many kids after about 10 years they have, how many kids? None. Sickly, and he's not going to last. Die. That's what we get instead of they had kids. So that as the storyteller tells the story, they're like, oh, they died? Elimelech died? And now Jalon and what was the other one's name? Mahlon, Chilion and Mahlon, they both die. So the family shrinks really down to one. And then it's interesting, in the next line, she seems to even lose her name. Because as at least the New American Bible translates it, and the woman was left with neither her two boys nor her husband. She doesn't even have a name anymore right there. It's kind of gloomy. It's hopeless. It sounds a little bit like another famous Old Testament story of Job. Job has everything. Everything is wonderful. And then Job loses everything. So some would argue that one of the reasons why this appears in the wisdom literature in the Hebrew scriptures is because it's to teach you how to act when you lose everything. Just like Job does that. You know, and people often say that the patience of Job. If you read the book of Job, Job doesn't have any patience at all. So when you think, okay, he endured his sufferings with great stoicism. No, he didn't. No, he's constantly saying to God, what? Why did you do this to me? Come on, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm a good guy. I was doing everything fine, and I lost everything. And then his friends are the ones who keep trying, oh, well, you must have sinned. You did something really wrong. And no, I didn't. Oh, think about it. You know, if you think a little bit more, I'm sure we'll come up with something. And no, I didn't. And then God finally comes in the end, and God tells the friends to shut up. You're all wrong, because what you said wasn't right. But then he also says to Job, stop complaining. If you can explain to me how everything is, then fine. But where were you when I put the stars in the sky? How did I do that? And how did I create the world? And how did I create the universe? And can you explain all those things? No. Well, then stop trying. Just be in relationship with me. Come on. Trust me. Here's how life is. Let's move on. And then Job says, you're right. I'm not going to talk anymore. And then he gets life restored. So this is a very similar story. Naomi has lost everything. So then they're in Moab, and they look back over to Bethlehem, and they say, hey, it's green over there now. So let's go back. And they head back. But on her way back, you could imagine she's walking back, and then she's starting to think about her friends back in Bethlehem. And, oh my, how am I going to explain all this? And I got these two Moabite women with me, and this is going to be hard to explain. What am I going to do with them? Who's going to take care of them? I don't have anything. I'm a widow. And the widow was the worst thing to be. If you didn't have a husband, you didn't have sons, you didn't have somebody to take care of you. Well, how is she going to survive? And not only was she going to have to survive, but she's going to have these two women with her. And so she's walking along thinking, and then as they get closer, she finally turns and says, stop. This isn't going to work. Go back. Go back, go back, go back. And then Orpah, finally, after they talk for a while, Orpah agrees to go back. But Ruth does not. Oh wait, now I didn't put the verses here. Oh, 8. In verse 8 of chapter 1, Naomi says to her daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house." Song of Songs, people. How good's your memory? When the mother's house or the mother's bedroom is referred to, that's where you get pregnant. So what Naomi is saying to them is, go back to your mother's house. Go back and find somebody else to love. Go back and have a child. Because that's what happens in your mother's house. It's a rendezvous place for lovers. For some reason. Why it's your mom's house. But it wasn't Song of Songs. It is here too. Yeah, so each of you go back to your mother's house. Go back and get pregnant. Because that's what you want in life. And then she says, "May the Lord show you the same kindness." That word kindness is chesed. "As you have shown to the deceased and to me." The scholars say that line can be found also in contracts, to end a contract. So it's ending the relationship. It's a formal way. "May the Lord show you the same kindness as you have shown to me." That's a kind of a formal statement of ending a relationship. So we get a bunch of different words for God in this book of Ruth. We actually, in that last one, "May the Lord show you the same kindness," that's not a Hebrew word for God there. But it might be because there are Moab women, she might be referring to the Chemosh, who was the god of the Moabites. So as a way of saying, may your God bless you. So you go off and be blessed. But then right away, she says, "May the Lord guide each of you to find a husband and a home in which you will be at rest." There she's using Yahweh. So she quickly switches from this Moab god to her God. A home in which you'll be at rest. Only God can give that. That's the promised land kind of idea. So she kisses them goodbye. They wept loudly. All three of them, it looks like, are weeping. They've had this relationship for more than 10 years. And so they're in a lot of pain. They want to stay with her. She must have been an amazing mother-in-law. Mother-in-laws oftentimes get joked about. But here, they really want to stay with their mother-in-law. So Naomi must have been a great person. But then she does this wonderful lament. And in the lament, she really is accusing God of screwing up her life. And she names her pain. "Go back, my daughters. Why, come with me. I don't have other sons in my womb who could become your husband." She's kind of naming her age. We didn't know how old she was, but at this point we're guessing she's not going to have babies anymore. She's too old to marry again. And even if she had such hope and could bear sons, then it would be another 15 years at least before they're capable of entering into marriage. So her lot is too bitter because God did this to her. So she's lamenting. And as we talked about last week, the lament in Israel is a fine tradition. And you cannot get things fixed until you can lament. So that's an essential thing. You have to be able to cry out to God in your pain, otherwise your pain won't go away. So her lament is not a bad thing here. God doesn't say, "Boy, that really makes me mad when you blame me for everything." It doesn't do that. In fact, God answers her lament by the trip back to Israel and to the person of Boaz. Because if you've read ahead through the whole thing, all 4 chapters, did you make it through it? Then if you get to the end, you realize who's the one who's blessed at the end? Naomi. Yeah, Naomi is restored, not Ruth. So this book should be Naomi instead of Ruth, because in the end, who's taking care of the baby? Naomi. Yeah. So she's restored to the land and to her position in the community. So her lament is heard. But Ruth clings to her. That word cling appears one other time in the book of Genesis. And then Jesus quotes it. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. So that's what Ruth is doing to her. She's saying, no, this is like being married. So she expresses deep loyalty and deep affection, just as if she was getting married. Ruth is abandoning her roots. She's abandoning Moab. She's abandoning the God that she knew there. She's modeling very adventurous faith. So she abandons what is sensible, what Orpah did, and she ventures into the unknown. She's never been to Israel. She doesn't know Bethlehem. Somehow they're communicating. So whatever language they're using there, they do have a common language, but when Ruth goes to Bethlehem, can she even talk to anybody else? That isn't addressed anywhere in the book, but probably was an issue. You all know that story then, the words that Ruth says to Naomi. It gets used at a lot of weddings. It's a true and total commitment. It's permanent. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. She renounces her roots. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. The devotion goes to the point of death. I'm going to be buried there beside you. So there's no return to her old life. She does not look back. She's a true disciple, kind of like in Jesus' words in Luke. You can't turn and look back to where you were. And then she kind of sums it up with this oath. May the Lord do thus to me and more, even if death separates me from you. There she uses Yahweh. So Ruth is using Naomi's God's name at that point. That was a common line, again, used in covenants. And in covenants, when you would breach that promise, there was punishment involved usually. So that was like signing a contract. So I will be punished if I break this contract. Naomi then stops talking to her, which is an odd thing. The New American doesn't say she stopped talking to her, ceased to urge her, but in the original, in the Hebrew, it's she stopped talking to her. Then they walk all the way to Bethlehem, which is a 50 to 70 miles, so it would take a few days, and Ruth must have wondered, is she ever going to talk to me again? As they're walking along, like, okay, she stopped talking. When are we going to talk? But they finally get there. They reach Bethlehem. And on their arrival, the whole town is excited about it. And the women ask, can this be lovely? And there's a little bit of irony in the question. Certainly the whole town has been gossiping about it. And then Naomi continues her lament. Don't call me lovely. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. For the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Interestingly, here she uses another name for God. So we don't have Yahweh. Do any of your Bibles have another name for God there on verse 20? Almighty. Anything besides Almighty? So remember the Amy Grant song years ago, El Shaddai? So that's El Shaddai. There is what she's using. So El Shaddai was the God of the mountain, the God of creation, a cosmic kind of God. The guess always was that it was a Canaanite God that the Jewish people adopted. They just kind of took the name because it kind of fit their God as well. So El Shaddai. But then right away in the next line, I went away full, but not El Shaddai, but there it's Yahweh brought me back empty. Naomi says, this is not just bad luck. Who's to blame? God. God brought me back empty. It's her lament. And why should you call me lovely, since the Lord brought me to trial? And then, so that's, since the Lord, Yahweh, has brought me to trial. And then again, the Almighty, it's El Shaddai again, has pronounced an evil sentence on me. So here she's kind of portraying herself as a defendant in a legal action, and she's been found guilty for some reason. But like the Psalms and like Job and like Jeremiah, she stands before God and laments about her suffering. And thus it was that Naomi came back with her Moabite daughter-in-law Ruth, who accompanied her from the plateau of Moab. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The barley harvest is in late April. The wheat harvest is in May. And then we move in to this chapter 2, what happens when they arrive in Bethlehem. So Naomi had a powerful relative named Boaz through the clan of her husband Elimelech. So he's an Ephrathite as well. So Ruth says to Naomi, I would like to go and glean grain in the field of anyone who will allow me. And Naomi says, go ahead, my daughter. Oh, I didn't bring a Bible down. Do we have the floating mic? Somebody want to find Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 to 22. verse 19 to 22. Yeah. Deuteronomy 24.
When you, excuse me, when you reap the harvest in your field and overlook a sheaf there, you shall not go back to get it. Let it be for the alien, the orphan, or the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. When you knock down the fruit of your olive trees, you shall not go over the branches a second time. Let what remains be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you pick your grapes, you shall not go over the vineyard a second time. Let what remains be for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. For remember that you were once slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to observe this rule.
All right, so that's the law. It appears also in Leviticus, so both in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. The law is that when you're doing the harvest and you're harvesting the grain, so you're grabbing a bunch of the barley with one hand and cutting it with a sickle with the other, and then you're holding it somewhere, and some of it is going to fall. You couldn't bend down and pick it up. So whatever fell. And it just is there, and then that has to be left for the poor, the widow, the orphans, the strangers, to come and pick up what fell. So if one of your workers dropped a big load, too bad. You can't bend down and pick it up. Now, a little bit later here, Boaz does what? He tells people to drop some for her. So, woo, shucks, yeah, I guess she's going to have to come by and pick that up. So somehow Ruth knows the law, or she's talking to others that during the harvest, this is what is going on. So the poor people are hanging around and waiting for them to finish the field. Now, the other thing that Boaz does a little bit later is he lets her come in right behind the harvesters, which they weren't supposed to do. They were supposed to let them get out of the field, and then the gleaners can come and pick up whatever is left behind. There's some debate about how they did that with the vineyards. As it said in Deuteronomy, you have to leave some grapes on the vine for the poor people who want to make their wine. Because when you're poor, you still want wine. So there's no reason why you can't have your wine. But they would go and harvest the grapes then. So, because the grapes weren't being dropped. Some probably were dropped, but they were clearly still on the vine. With the olives, the same kind of thing. They were probably olives that just kind of spilled out when you were trying to pick them up, because you're shaking the tree, as it said, and you're trying to catch it all in your blankets, and then some would fall on the ground. So that's the law. And Ruth wants to do that. And so Naomi says, do it. Go ahead, my daughter. Now, Naomi does not warn her of the dangers. Now, I'm personally not aware of the dangers of harvest, but the scholars say that, so what would happen during the harvest is people would come in and help the owners who had other jobs most of the time. And so they would be like people in Nebraska during harvest. You get a special crew in to help you bring in the big combines. So there would be a lot of people, because the harvest had to be got quickly. And they're not always the best workers. And they would sleep in the fields. So they would harvest all day long, make a big pile of the barley or the wheat, and then they would sleep around it. The owner would come out, as Boaz does, and sleep there as well, to make sure that nobody's stealing it. So they would take care of it. So what would happen is some ladies who didn't have the best reputation would come out to the fields, and they would engage the workers in other activities. So that is not a part of Naomi's warning to her that, oh, be careful, there's not always the best of folks are out there during harvest time. So Ruth goes, and the field she entered to glean after the harvesters happened, surprise! And that's what the scholars say. That's supposed to be like when they're telling the tale, it's like, what? What field did you just happen to go to? Was the one belonging to Boaz, of the same clan of Elimelech. So the listeners would be like, wow, that's just such a surprise. So who is behind all this? God, in the storytellers. So Naomi's lamenting, God's responding. All right, let's make it a little easier for her. Go to the field of Boaz. And then Boaz comes along and says to his harvesters, this is a very nice formal greeting at harvest time, the Lord be with you. That sounds familiar. But we have a different answer. They respond, the Lord bless you, and we say, with your spirit. So the scholars say this is a formal greeting done at harvest time. Normally, the greeting would be, if you know Jewish rabbis and those kind of folks, would be shalom. So that's the normal greeting. So the Lord be with you, and the Lord bless you is a very formal greeting done between peoples. It reminds people during the harvest that who's in charge of the harvest? God. God's the owner of the land. God grew the crops. God gets his part. It all belongs to God. So Boaz then asks the young man who's in charge of all those harvesters, hey, who's that chick? No. Who's young? The question is, whose young woman is this? Not who is she? Who does she belong to? He knows all his workers, and he's curious about her. And the young man responds, she's the young Moabite who came back with Naomi from the plateau of Moab. So he reminds her of her origin, her association with Naomi, and that she has no husband, no family, no owner. And then he says how this thing went. Well, she said she'd like to gather the gleanings. She doesn't have to ask. So Ruth is being very polite there, or she's being very bold. So that's kind of one of the questions of the scholars is she saying, I want to be first? Can I get up there first, right after the harvesters? Is it bold, or is it just a polite request? And then he says, she's been here all day. She came here this morning. She's working until now. She's scarcely had a moment's rest. What the young man doesn't say is, I gave her permission. He doesn't say anything about what he did. But he's speaking to her character. So then Boaz walks over to her. He speaks to her. Listen, my daughter. Uses the same word that Naomi uses for her. It might also say he sees himself as quite a bit older than she is. but he really likes her. Now, is this because she's a hard worker? Or is it because he's a little bit attracted there? And he says, I like her. And so don't go anywhere else. You'll be safe here. I'm going to tell the other workers to keep an eye on you. Stay here with my young women, which he's really kind of saying, I'm going to protect you. Watch to see which fields are to be harvested. Follow them. I have commanded the young men to do you no harm. So when he's saying follow them, he's letting her go right behind those who have done the harvest. So that's where he gives her permission to do that. And also, if she's really close to the harvesters, they might tease her or hurt her in some way. And so he's said no, because she's going to come right behind them to pick up what they've dropped. And then he gives her permission, when you're thirsty, you can go drink from their bags. So no problem there, which will greatly benefit her productivity, because otherwise, if she has to go to the well or go somewhere else to get a drink, then she's delayed. So he's helping her out a bit here. Her response to this is she throws herself down on the ground and says to him, but why should I, a foreigner, be favored? His response surprises her. And so she shows humility. And actually, the listeners in the oral tradition might be wondering the same thing. She's not family, but he's treating her like family. Why is he noticing what should be unnoticed? And then he answers that he's been talking to his buddies or somewhere. He's heard the full account of what she has done for Naomi after your husband's death. So she's certainly a topic of conversation around town. She might have been quite the looker, so everybody's trying to figure out who is she, who's that woman who we've not seen before. So let's figure this out. You left your father and your mother in the land of your birth. You've come to the people you previously did not know. So this is a good guy. Boaz is saying he knows she's hurting, that she's experienced great loss. And so he's offering her chesed, some care for her. And then he says, may the Lord reward what you have done. May you receive a full reward from Yahweh, from the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. That's a common Old Testament image for God, under God's wings. And Boaz might be saying, really, only God can fill that debt, that deep pain that you're feeling. But Boaz doesn't know it yet, but he's going to be the instrument by which that debt is repaid. And then she responds very lovingly, may I prove worthy of your favor, and you have comforted me. She's relieved of her apprehension about her new home as a foreigner, as a woman. There might have been just a deep sigh of relief there. Okay, this guy's going to let me work here. You have spoken to the heart of your servant, and I'm not even one of your servants. He's empathetic and kind to her, and that, her response to him, maybe leaves him speechless, because that's the end of the conversation. Until later, at mealtime, Boaz says to her, "Come and eat at the table with us. Dip your bread in the sauce." So he treats Ruth not as a servant, but as a member of his own family there. He's generous and kind. He's kind of a model of racial and religious tolerance. She sits near the harvesters then, and he hands her some of his own meal, some of the roasted grain. She eats her fill and has some left over and puts that in her purse. That's a real luxury for a gleaner because they're so poor, they normally have nothing left. So then the change happens. She rose to glean, and Boaz instructs the young people, let her glean among the sheaves without scolding her, and even drop some handfuls and leave them for her to glean. Do not rebuke her. So they leave this extra behind, and they preserve her dignity. They're just not giving it to her. She still has to get it, but it is a chance to have her own dignity preserved. So she gleans in the field, and then after she had gleaned, she had about an ephah of barley. That is 30 pounds. So it's about a half a bushel of grain that she gets. It's an amazing amount, testifies to how much they're leaving behind. So she takes it and shows it to Naomi. She must have brought this big bag in, and she gives her the leftovers from the meal. And then her mother-in-law says to her, excited and just amazed, well, where did you glean today? Where did you work? And may the one who took notice of you be blessed. And then she tells him that his name is Boaz. And then Naomi kind of exclaims, "Oh, God be blessed, for he never fails to show his kindness to the living and the dead, because this man is a close relative, and he is a Goel." So then we get into the whole notion of the Goel. And Ruth continues to say, well, he let me have these special places. And Naomi encourages her to stay there and keep working there. So she stays there now through the barley harvest and through the wheat harvest. That entire time would be about 7 weeks. So Boaz has a chance to keep an eye on her for 7 weeks. They have a lot of little conversations together, most likely. And we get ready for what's going to happen next week. So, I don't want to spoil it for you. So, but you've probably already read what happens on the threshing floor. And we'll talk about that next week. Any questions? There's a question from Zoom.
One question from Zoom that was from earlier, and I missed it. Did the Moabites also recognize only one God, or did they have multiple gods?
The only God I'm aware of is this Chomesh, but I don't know much about the characteristics of that God, but I can look that up. Talk about it next week.
Is that law about gleaning, the Levitical, 10% thing? Is the law that we have from the Old Testament about gleaning, is that the precursor to our tithing?
No. There's still the tithe that was expected to go to God. So 10% is another portion as well. So this is in addition to that. This is for those who are poor, and it was, you see it throughout the Old Testament where God's reminding them who they are, that they are a people who were slaves themselves, and a people who were strangers, and a people who were aliens. And so treat other people who are in need well, because you were like that. Don't forget who you are, especially widows and orphans. And it was the kind of the Jewish notion that you could tell how good a village was by how well they treated their poorest. And if you don't treat your poor well, then that speaks a lot about you. That you're
More of a social justice.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, but good question. Any others? All right. So questions for next week? So you can have some fun again? Maybe I have questions. Uh-oh. I just spilled wine on the questions. So your questions will smell of wine. What happened to the wine? Forgot it was there. Bye, Pete. Yes, we're done.